Hey guys, I'm Redeemed Zoomer. So I make a lot of denomination videos, that's kind of my thing, but some of them are more serious than others. The last one I made was just totally goofy, not meant to be taken seriously at all. But this one I think can actually be very helpful for people deciding which church to join. Because a lot of times people will get interested in a specific Christian tradition, but there's no churches of that tradition near them. So I think this map of the different denominations and how close they are to each other can help you determine which church is closest to the one of your desired tradition. And the reason I think this is important to talk about is because a lot of times people have a pretty distorted view of how close different denominations are to each other. I've seen people who grew up Lutheran go to like a non-denominational church when they're in college because that's what their friends are going to, but they never go to a Catholic church because that's Catholic and that's different. As if the non-denominational church isn't way more different. I think the jump from Lutheran to non-denominational is way bigger than the jump from Lutheran to Catholic. So, I mean, if you want, you could just screenshot this and use it whenever you need it and then stop watching the video, but I think I should at least explain why I think the denominations are placed where they are. So the first thing you might notice is that the classical Protestant churches, like Presbyterian, Reformed, Lutheran, Anglican, and to a lesser extent Methodist and Congregationalist, you'll notice they're closer to Catholic than they are to Baptist and non-denominational. Why is that? Well, because the classical Protestant churches are very closely based on the beliefs of the Reformers, and the Reformers thought that the Baptists were more wrong than Catholics. They thought the Anabaptists were more heretical than the Roman Catholics. Now, I don't think either Baptists or Catholics are heretical. I'm just saying what the Reformers believed, and these traditions are based on the beliefs of the Reformers. Now, I did put Anabaptist and Baptist as separate. I understand modern-day Baptists are not the same as Anabaptists, but the reason the Reformers considered Anabaptists heretical, the things they condemned the Anabaptists for, are exactly the same things that modern-day Baptists believe, such as thinking the sacraments are just symbols and not baptizing babies. And non-denominationals have all the same beliefs as Baptists generally, but to a greater extent. That's why they're even further away. So Luther himself was very clear about this. Luther himself thought that believing communion is just a symbol and not believing communion is the real body and blood of Christ. He believed that that is a bigger and more serious error than anything the Catholics believed. So, in that sense, if you're Lutheran, you have to admit that it's closer to Catholicism than it is to Baptist or non-denominational. So, the classical Protestant traditions are obviously a lot closer to Catholic than they are to some of the more radical Protestant groups like Baptist or Pentecostal, because the classical Protestant traditions are based directly on the beliefs of the Reformers, and these more radical Protestant groups are based indirectly on the beliefs of the Reformers. Now, the Catholics might say that it's still the fault of the classical Protestants that these radical Protestants exist, but the Eastern Orthodox could also say it's the fault of the Catholics that Protestants exist, and the Oriental Orthodox could say it's the fault of the Eastern Orthodox that all these Western Christians exist. So you could take it back infinitely many steps. And then you could say, like, the Orthodox Jews could say it's Christianity's fault there's so many different denominations of Abrahamicism. You could take that infinitely steps back, so it's just pointless, I think. Now, I think the closest thing to Presbyterian, which is what I am, is Dutch Reformed. Because theologically, I've not been able to find any real differences doctrinally between Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed. There's slightly different tendencies. I think Dutch Reformed are a bit closer to Lutherans in their law-gospel distinction. That's why I put them a bit closer. The Heidelberg Catechism defines assurance to be the essence of faith. Of the essence of faith. And the Heidelberg Catechism is part of the Dutch Reformed standards, whereas the Westminster Confession, which Presbyterians use, says that assurance is not of the essence of faith, and that moves in a more Puritan Congregationalist direction than a Lutheran law-gospel direction. So that's the one and only actual theological difference I was able to find in the confessions of Presbyterians versus Dutch Reformed. I think Dutch Reformed churches tend to have more of a three-office view of church structure, and Presbyterians more of a two-office view. Aside from that, they're basically identical, and there's always been cross-pollination between the Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed traditions. The Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed are really like the Greek and Russian Orthodox, or the Coptics and Armenians, Oriental Orthodox, like, different cultural heritages, different languages, but really the same faith. So the differences are minuscule. Now, I think Presbyterians are about equidistant between Anglicans and Congregationalists. because the dispute between these three denominations, they're all from Great Britain, and they all originally held to Calvinist beliefs, but they disagreed on how to run the church. And I've been reading a lot of Presbyterian writings, like from the Scottish Westminster Divines, like George Gillespie and Samuel Rutherford and Robert Bailey, and they seem to equally condemn Episcopalianism, which the Anglicans hold to, where you have bishops, and Congregationalism, where you have just a bunch of independent churches. They seemed to see the bishops as tyranny from above, whereas the independent Congregationalists as tyranny from below. And it's sort of like Anglicanism is like a monarchy, Episcopalianism is like a monarchy, Presbyterianism is like a representative republic, and Congregationalism is like a pure democracy. So I think Presbyterianism is equally between the two. So if you want to know what I'd be if I wasn't Presbyterian, obviously Dutch Reformed, but if that doesn't count because it's basically the same, I'd be very torn between Anglican or a Congregationalist. Now what about Methodist? Now in some ways, Methodist is further from Presbyterian than Anglican because Methodist moves in a more Arminian direction. But at the same time, Methodist moves in a more low church direction, so in one sense it's moving away from Presbyterians, another sense toward Presbyterians. So I think Methodists are also in some sense pretty similar to Presbyterians. Now, there's like the Nazarene holiness churches and Pentecostals, which come from Methodist theology, but take it to really radical, extreme conclusions. Every 100 years, Methodism forms a new Methodism that thought the previous Methodists weren't methoding hard enough. I always say that. So in some sense, I'd say the Methodists are closer to the Anglicans they came from than the groups that splintered off from them. Okay, so now Baptists and non-denominationals. Baptists are pretty far from classical Protestants, but closer than some other groups which have essentially Baptist theology, such as non-denominationals. And I think Baptists are kind of like diluted Anabaptists. Baptists are the cafe Americano to the dark espresso of the Anabaptists. Now let's talk about Catholics and Orthodox. Obviously, they have a lot of similarities. They're not quite identical. I would say that Catholics and certain Protestants are closer than Catholics and Orthodox, but it's very, very debatable because these traditions are just so huge. It's very hard to accurately demarcate the differences. And I'd say Byzantine Catholics. This is, by the way, one of the first times I'm ever talking about Eastern Catholicism. People ask me, like, oh, Zoomer, what are your thoughts on Eastern Catholicism? I'm like, probably a mix on my thoughts between Catholicism and my thoughts on Orthodoxy, you know? Because Byzantine Catholics are Catholics that are in communion with the Pope, but liturgically and traditionally they're Eastern. So, naturally, their theology is just a mix of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox theology. And what the Catholic Church it'll have like a rite in basically every other tradition. So there's Alexandrian Catholics that are liturgically very close to Oriental Orthodox. And there's also like Armenian Catholics who are liturgically very close to Armenian Orthodox Christians. So now, obviously, theologically, the various Oriental Orthodox churches are going to be very close to each other. I think of all the Oriental Orthodox churches, Armenians are closest to Eastern Orthodoxy because they have that cultural influence from like the Russian Empire and stuff. I think of all the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Syriac churches are closest to the Assyrian Church of the East. While Assyrian Church of the East Christians are on the opposite end of the Christological spectrum from Coptic Christians, because the Coptics were more Monophysite, Miaphysite really, and the Assyrians were more Nestorian. The differences have been largely exaggerated. The Miaphysites weren't as Monophysite as the Chalcedonians thought they were, and the Nestorians weren't as Nestorian as the Council of Ephesus thought they were. So, really, there are indeed a lot of similarities between Assyrian Christians and Coptic Christians, even if they did end up on opposite sides of the Christological debates of the 5th century. So, aside from that, I think everything else is pretty self-explanatory. I don't know how much of this is all that controversial, but yeah, so if you want to join a Dutch Reformed church, but there's no Dutch Reformed churches around you, join a Presbyterian church. If you want to be Methodist, but there's no Methodist churches around you, you'd probably be equally happy in a Baptist or an Anglican church. If you want to be an Alexandrian Catholic specifically, unless you have some like culture or heritage in the Alexandrian Catholic Church, I think you're probably just a LARPer. And if you want to be Quaker or Seventh-day Adventist, please don't. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later.